What's up and welcome to another Mograph tutorial. I'm Dave Koss and today we are going to be going over some of the basics of TFD. We're not going over everything, it's just some of the basics that will get you started real quick in TFD, especially if you've never used it before. If you're familiar with other plugins and things that use gravity and particles and things, you might feel fairly comfortable in this. If you've never done it before, this is how you can get some results really quick, and then you can expand on that as much as you want, dig down as far and as deep as you want into settings and get as realistic as you want. I'm doing this a little bit different than I have in the past. I'm not doing a step-by-step breakdown. I'm going to show you a very simple scene with all the different settings and what they do, and I'm going to explain them in detail, and then I'm going to break down a scene that I did on Instagram, and you can see how I use those techniques to make that render. So let's dive in and let's learn some of the basics of TurbulenceFD. Let's start out with a completely blank scene and dive right into this. I'm going to go to extensions here and I'm going to go to TurbulenceFD and I'm going to make a new TurbulenceFD container. Now here's the thing. I usually don't change the size of this container that much. I might make it a little bigger or smaller, but I don't do like massive scale, because once you scale this up massively, sometimes it gets a little unstable. Sometimes you have some problems with voxel size and the whole sim in general. So I know that usually it's a big no-no to not work in scale, but if you can avoid working in scale with something like this, it's going to make your sims a little bit easier. I know it's a little different, but if you can scale your scene down to accommodate, I think, just in my experience, I've had better luck with it. Maybe you'll have better luck. But so we're going to start with this at default here. Now, once we have this in here, the other thing we're going to do is go back to TurbulenceFD and open a simulation window. We're going to be using this a lot, so I'm going to go ahead and dock it right here, just so that we can get easy access to it. Now we're going to add a disk into the scene. I'm going to put it right here inside the box. Scale it down a little bit, and I don't know, I'm going to put it about right here. I'm also going to put a cube in the scene, and I'm going to make it kind of thin. I'm going to turn it into a rectangle, actually. And that's going to be a collider object. We'll talk about that in a second. But let's go back to the disk, and we're going to add a TFD tag, because this is going to be our emitter. I'm going to click on that, and over here in our simulation window, we have a couple different options. The number one option is what type of simulation hardware you're going to use. So I usually use my GPU. I'm going to use GPU 0 in this case, because I'm recording and I'm using the other one right now. So this is the one for me. Now you can use CPU to do these sims, but it's going to be a lot slower. So if you have a graphics card that's capable of doing the sim, it's going to be so much faster. So make sure you use that. The next option here, we've got cache, interactive, and upres. We're not talking about upres stuff today. This is just kind of an introductory thing. So let's move this to interactive. This is where we're going to set up our sim, and we're really going to see what our smoke looks like before we cache it. So this is just going to be interactive mode. I'm going to hit start, and you're going to notice that nothing is happening. Now that is because on my disk emitter, I haven't set anything for it to do yet as far as burn, fuel, density, or temperature. Now in this tutorial, we're only going to be doing temperature, but I'm going to set the value for temperature to 1 so that we're simulating temperature here. You're going to see that something starts happening, and it's actually really fast. You know, with a decent GPU, you can get a sim going pretty quick. So you can see that everything's going now. And I'm going to show you what radius does here. If you think of this kind of like the size of the particles, it kind of makes sense in that manner. If I take the radius up to 1, you're going to see what happens is the sim gets a little bit more poofy here. The particles are bigger. It's more of a larger scale type of smoke rather than like a steam. You can see that it's even bigger if I just ramp this number up. But there's not a lot of detail. It's just poofy smoke. And that might be good if you're doing a really large scene. But right now we're going to be doing something small. If you were doing steam, for example, let me take this to 0.1 and you can see you get that really, really fine steam look, that fine detail there. But we're going to set this back to the default of 0.394. And we're going to go to the next step. We're going to take this cube, which is now a rectangle technically, and we're going to go up to tags and we're going to add another TurbulenceFD. It says emitter, but it's a tag for collision objects as well. This one we're not going to do anything with the temperature. We're just going to leave it as is because we're going to be using this as a collision object. So if I click the checkbox for collision object, you're going to see we get a very cool looking effect here of the smoke or the steam hitting the rectangle. And we're going to go ahead and you cannot turn the checkbox off next to it because then it will not use it for the sim anymore. You turn off the render and the top one, the viewport view, and then the bottom one, the render view, so it doesn't show up anywhere. We're just using it as a collider object, as you can see. And something else that you're going to notice here there are some lines. If you look closely, you can see that there are, if I pause it here, we'll go in, you can see that there are these lines that happen right here and right here. And what that is there are not enough iterations. So for between frame to frame, the calculations that's happening from frame to frame are not calculated in between the frame. Anything that happens between those two steps. So if you go to your container, to the simulation window, you could change this to get a lot smoother sim. You can see there's more lines up here. And if you change your sub steps maybe to something like 4, your simulation is going to get really heavy. And that's all well and good. And that will look nice, but sometimes you don't need to go that far because when you add turbulence and you add detail and motion blur and all sorts of things to your scene, you might not even see that. So it might not be worth it. If it does become a problem though, you can go ahead and step up the sub steps before you do your final sim, and that'll help a lot. But for now, we're going to go back and turn that to 1. I just thought it was important to note if you're having problems with that stepping thing. And you can see these lines kind of come back, but we'll worry about that later. Now let's talk about voxel size inside the container. The container under the container tab has a voxel size, and just think of this container having a whole bunch of cubes inside of it. And what size are those cubes? Because those cubes are going to make up the bits and pieces of the smoke or the steam. So by default, we've got 0.394, and I usually leave it there and I'll bring it down to give a little more resolution to the sim. I'm going to turn off my sim and bring the voxel size up to maybe like 0.8 and just show you what it does here. There's a lot less resolution inside of this now. And so it's just kind of a more basic sim. Sometimes this is good to kind of art direct what you want and get a fast sim and just understand what the smoke is going to do, what it's going to look like. So, you know, you can leave that up if you have problems with your sim or your hardware isn't fast enough to really give you a fast interactive sim. I'm going to put it back though to 0.394, the default. I'm going to restart this interactive sim here just so you can see what it's doing again. It's also important to note that if you're using a collider object that it needs to be thicker than the radius of these said particles that are going through it with the smoke. And here's an example. One of the mistakes I made at the very beginning is when I was trying to do collider objects, I would use flat pieces of geometry like a plane, and I didn't understand why it wasn't working. So like if I put this plane in here right now and I add a TurbulenceFD collision tag to it, and I hit start, let's go ahead and turn the cube off, you're going to see that it goes right through the plane. And that is because it has no thickness. This also applies if you're even using something like a cube or, I don't know, a tube, and the thickness of the walls is too thin. So if you're having that problem where it's going through, it's probably the thickness of the collider object isn't thick enough. So I'm going to turn the cube back on. We're back to our original sim. And now let's talk about turbulence a little bit. I'm going to go back to my container, to the simulation tab, and go to turbulence. And let's talk about it a little bit. If I do something like 5 in here under the intensity, which you should think of more of as like intensity and not inches. It's hard to really think about it in inches. So if I put 5, I'm going to get some turbulence inside of this box. And just to show you a more extreme example, I'm going to go up to like 50. You can see what this is doing. It's creating some very interesting looks here. I could go way up to like 500 and really show you. Get almost like this fuzzy looking smoke because there's just so much turbulence. But let's go back down to 50 for a second and talk about the other options. You've got smallest size, largest size, and small power. And let's start with largest size. I'm going to make this a lot bigger. I'm going to say something like 5, and you're going to see these huge waves going through here. And that's because the noise is kind of moving through this as turbulence in these big 5-inch waves. And you'll notice here that you have period at the bottom, and that's the amount of time it takes for one of those big waves to kind of wave through this. So if you want it to wave through really fast, you could put something like 2 frames and it would just like pass through it really fast. It's almost so fast that you're not going to notice what it's doing. If you bring it down, or sorry, bring it up to like 120 frames, it'll like gradually move this noise through here. And what you're going to even see is possibly like some heavy sways and flows from side to side. If I increase the large size here to maybe something like 50, you're really going to see what happens here. These big waves of turbulence start going through it, and it's going to shift from right to left during these 120 frame periods. This is a super extreme case. Usually I would keep the largest size, maybe not even larger than 1 inch. I'm going to take the period back to 30 so we can work on this a little bit more. But doing fun things with that and even keyframing it can cause, as you can see here, a lot of really cool effects within your smoke. So let's talk about smallest size now. Right now the smallest turbulence is 0.7, but I'm going to bring it down to something more like 0.2. We're really going to get that fine turbulence detail in there. Now, if we really want to ramp that up, this is where small power would come in. It only goes between 0 and 1, so I'm going to put it at 1 so you can see the really fine turbulence show up. I'll bring up the intensity even to like 100 so you can see these really small pieces that are coming in here. But let's go ahead and zero all of this back out. We're not going to work with the with the turbulence right now at the moment. So I put 0 on it and we're back to normal. Just that's something that you would add once you really get the sim developed where you want it to start adding a little more character to it. I'm going to put the turbulence intensity down to 0. I might add it back in later if I feel like it needs a little bit of it. It's going to slow down our sim just a little bit as well, so I'll just leave it at that for now, just so I can show other things without the sim taking too long. And let's talk about wind a little bit. Now, wind obviously is pretty self-explanatory what wind is in general, but you can change the direction here by changing the wind speed. You've got your X, Y, and Z directions here. Most of the time you're going to be using X and Z if you're in a situation like this where you're shooting the smoke up. You're not really going to use much of the Y. And let me show you. The wind speed, if I set it to say 50, now we're blowing the smoke this way. Let's turn it down. That's a little bit extreme. I'm going to maybe go to something like 20 right here. That's pretty good. And we're blowing all of the smoke from left to right here on the x-axis. If I do a -1 for the direction, it's going to go the other direction. So these are just values that you put in 1 or -1 really. The same thing would apply to the z. If I go on 1, it's going to go back this direction. You could do a combination of X and Z if you wanted it to go diagonal, but you see this affects the flow, and I can do -1 and it goes toward the camera like this. So that's how you can kind of control the direction that it's blowing. But if you change the wind direction, for example, to -1 on Y, the wind is pushing down. And so what will happen is when the smoke comes up and hits the rectangle, the wind will then push it back down. This doesn't affect the speed of which the smoke and the steam is coming out of the emitter. It just controls what happens to it after it comes out, which the wind is pushing it down. If I brought this wind speed up even more to like 50, you're going to see it really start to blow the smoke down after it hits the rectangle. So that's kind of to give you an idea of what wind does. And when I show an example later on, I'm going to show how I use the wind a little bit to art direct where the smoke goes in the rocket ship. So I'm zeroing that back out now. So we're going to move on to temperature a little bit, and you'll see that even when we had the wind pushing down, the smoke was going up, and that's because of its temperature. Heat rises, obviously, and so we're going to go into the temperature tab and talk about it a little bit. You've got your cooling. That's the first thing we're going to talk about. And right now you can see that this smoke is hitting the top of the box, and then it just kind of stops. Now, if we wanted to see all of that, we could expand the box. Of course, we could scale the box up, but what I want to do actually is have the smoke or steam cool by the time it gets to the top. It's just lasting a little bit too long. Now, if this were a giant scaled sim, like maybe a giant plume of smoke from a rocket ship, that plume is going to stick around for a really long time. So the half-life of this cooling is going to be way up there. Let's say it could be minutes. If we put this up to maybe like 900 frames, that's 30 seconds of half-life. And then after that, it exponentially cools back down. But on a big sim, what that's going to do is these particles are going to stick around for a really long time. And it's just going to become a massive, larger, slower sim. Now, sometimes you might have to do that, but the reason you don't want your half-life up that high, number one, is because it will look funny if steam hangs around for like 2 minutes. But also, it's going to be a really long sim time. So, in most cases, you wouldn't have it up to 900 frames. I'm going to put it back down, and in this case, I'm actually going to go lower to something like 15, because what I want is for the half-life to be such that by the time the smoke gets to the top of the box, it's actually pretty cool. Now, if there's a little lingering amount, we can take care of that in our rendering, but I'm actually going to bring this down a little bit more to say like 12. So after it hits the box, it pretty much dissipates. It's almost like that cube collider is cooling it down a little bit, and then it just kind of dissipates. But that's what I'm looking for right there. Let's talk about buoyancy a little bit as well. I've got the buoyancy here set to the default of 7.8. If I bring that up, you'll see that the particles are trying to get to the top as fast as they can, and moving in that direction of positive Y. That's why you've got the 1 here in this box. It's moving so fast you can even see these steps in between frames, so you would have to do more iterations of your sub-steps if you really wanted to clean that up. But this is a little high. This isn't something we would really use that often, but let me take it back down to something like 5 for now, just to show this. Now, if we change the buoyancy direction, for example, to -1, it's going to go the other direction. And this is what you would use for maybe something like dry ice, if you're making a cauldron or something. And you can see that it flows downward. The buoyancy is negative. It makes it go down. So if I were to take this cube that we had as the collider, and I move it down and maybe try and make a floor out of it, I need to be able to see this. You'll see what happens a little bit once it hits the floor. As it starts to spread out, you get these cool lines. It's very cauldron-y. That's very Halloweenish. This is what you would use for some dry ice. So you can see, using this example, how buoyancy affects the sim. But I'm deleting that floor. I'm bringing this back down so we can get back to that original sim here. I'm going to go back to the buoyancy direction. Let's just put it to 7. It was around that for the default. And then we're going to take the buoyancy direction back up to positive Y, so that we're running this sim again. That's pretty close to what we had going originally. I do want to show vorticity real quick. This is something to have in your back pocket because it adds more swirls and things into it. This is something I like to go in and add later on if I need to add a little more character to steam or smoke. Now let's talk about pressure a little bit. Pressure is something that you're going to change depending on what type of emitter this is. Is this just a standstill cauldron and there's just some real slow fog coming out of it, or is this a rocket ship that's just pouring out tons and tons and tons of smoke and fire? And that's where pressure comes into play. You're going to see that there's a huge difference when it comes to scale, or the scale of your scene or what you're actually rendering. If I go down to If I go to the emitter tag for this disk, you're going to see that there is a force section here. And there's a couple options that I don't really use that often. You can add some directional force to the particles to begin with. Like, let's say, if I put 50 inches on Y, it's going to add kind of a boost to this. It's going to push it up a little faster. Same thing if I add it, like, say, to X. This is more of an art directional thing, in my opinion, if you want to add a little bit of initial force to some of this. It's not something I would use that often because I would control that with other things like pressure and wind, but it's there. You also have normal force, which will push it in the direction of the normals of where it's coming out of. But the pressure is what I really want to show off here. Now, the pressure is set to 0. If I go in and I change it to, like, let's say 500, you're going to see it's almost like this is how you would do a blast. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll actually keyframe the pressure in a blast to have it start for a few frames with really heavy pressure, like maybe a nuke went off or a bomb went off or something, and then I'll slowly bring back in that keyframe back down to 0 to kind of see the aftermath. So you can see if I change it to 0 here, that initial blast kind of goes away. So that's something I do a lot. It's not something you want to keyframe though until you're really certain what you want to do, because you're not really going to see the keyframes affect your interactive sim. It's only going to happen when you go to do your final cache of your sim. The other thing you can do, let's say I bring this super high, like 10,000. It's going to be like absolutely ridiculous. You can't even see anything here. Let me bring it down to 5,000. Not even that's working very well. Okay, 500, let's say. All right, you're going to start seeing it coming out here. I'm going to start over the sim so you can see. So that pressure is blasting up. And if I take the pressure now and add a negative to the beginning of it, watch what happens. Almost like a vacuum, it kind of sucks it back in. So the pressure is negative. So that's something you can actually use as well if you want to like suck some of it back in a certain direction. So I'm going to put that back to 0 just so we have our normal sim going here again. And now we're going to finish up this sim a little bit. Now, I like that it's cooling, but I think it's just a little too much cooling. Even if we hit the side of these bounding boxes, I think it's going to be pretty much okay. But I'm going to up the cooling on the temperature. Let's change the half-life to maybe like 18 frames. It's just going to go a little bit further up. I like that a little bit more. I think something else we need to do is maybe increase the buoyancy just a little bit. I'm going to go to 10. And I'm also going to go back to this pressure. I'm going to bring it up slightly, maybe like 5. Let's start slow and just see what this does. I'm really trying to get some thick plumes going after it hits the rectangle. I think one of the things I might do is increase the radius of the particle a little bit to like maybe 0.5. And we're getting some thickness here. We're not really going for light steam. We're going a little more for heavy smoke or heavier smoke here coming off of this. And you're going to see the lines. That means I probably need to work with my sub steps, these iterations, a little bit, but I like how that looks. So let's go back to the container because we're going to do our sim. I think I'm going to bring the voxel size down a little bit just so we can pull some better resolution out of this in general. I'm probably going to do 0.1, which is going to make my sim go quite a bit slower, which is fine because we're getting to the portion of this now where we're going to cache this out because we like the look of it in general. So now you can see I'm letting it run, and you have a lot more character and definition within this sim because I gave it more resolution by decreasing that voxel size inside the container. So that's looking really cool right there. It's got a lot more definition and it's really starting to look like something now. I would probably go in as well if I needed to, and I would do more sub steps. But like I said earlier, sometimes you don't need that right away. And those steps will end up getting lost once you modify your sim. I think this looks really good, but I think it needs just slightly a little more characters. So let's go in now. We're going to add a little turbulence, and this is how I'm going to make sure it looks good. I'm going to take my voxel size back to 0.394 where it was, just so I can see this in the sim. And that's usually how I work. I'll go back to where it's fast, I'll make the change, and then I'll make it slow again for my final sim. I'm going to go to the container, and I'm going to go to the simulation tab and go down to turbulence. And I'm going to do something fairly low, maybe start even with 1, just to see what that does. I don't really see much on there, so let's go to 10. And we should start to get a little turbulence working in here. We'll just give it a second to catch up with itself. Now, I would like some small power in here, but probably not that much. Let's say 0.8. Smallest size, I'm probably going to put 0.1. And largest size, let's bring that down just a little bit, maybe 0.8. I'm going to increase the turbulence intensity a little more, maybe to 20. And restart the simulation so we can really get a good idea of what that looks like. You can see the turbulence in it now. It actually has a little bit of character, which is nice. And I'm also going to do that little trick here where I bring in a little bit of vorticity, not much, maybe 1 or 2. Or maybe even 3. Let's see what it looks like. And so now we got a little bit of character to this, and we're going to go put it back into the more detailed high-res sim, which is going to be going to the container. We're going to change the voxel size to 0.1. I'm going to hit stop on my sim and restart it, and this is what we end up with. And you can see all of the character here that's coming out of this, from the vorticity, from the turbulence. It's going to look really nice. I don't really need to even finish that out. I like where it's going, and I want to go ahead and sim the whole thing. I don't see a lot of problems with steps. We might get some steps, some step issues down here at the bottom eventually. If we do, we can always go back and resim it with more iterations. But I think that's really cool looking. And so we're going to go ahead and run the sim so that we can go texture this in a render engine. So I'm going to hit stop on this interactive sim, and I'm going to switch over to cache, and this is going to save a file of this on my computer now. So I'm going to hit start, and it's going to go through the sim just as it did before, but now it's actually saving it to something that we can render out in a viewport, and that'll actually be easy to scroll through and watch in real time once it's done. And that's coming along nicely, and in the meantime I'll just say this is the basics. There's so much more that you can do in TurbulenceFD, but the stuff that I just showed you is really all you need to really start going on something and getting something that's art directable. And you can drill down into the other options as you go. You can learn about them, but if you want to just get started in this, those are the basic functions that are really going to get you to a place you want to be really fast. Alright, it looks like we're coming up on the end of the sim, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how we're going to skin this. Now, I'm going to use Octane. I'm going to render this in Octane, but the thing is, you might not have Octane, and that's understandable, but the theory involved in rendering this is just about the same no matter what engine you're using, so you can follow along or not. If you already know how to render a sim like this, then feel free to go ahead and skip to the next part where I'll kind of do the breakdown on how I practically used some of these techniques. But I think it's important to follow along even if you don't have Octane, because you're really going to learn a lot about control. And these options are going to be different a little bit in a different engine, but they're basically the same concept, the same theory. So I'd encourage you to watch this part as well. Also, I have to say that the default render that Maxon has put into Cinema 4D does an incredible job of rendering this TurbulenceFD stuff straight out of the box almost. So if you don't have a GPU render engine or a third-party render engine, don't worry. It actually works really well. And sometimes to save time, I actually, if I'm comping fire or smoke into something, I will use the Cinema 4D standard renderer just to get a pass out because it looks really good. It's usually not until I'm doing some sort of scene in Octane or in Redshift that I use their shaders to accomplish this, like if it needs to interact with other things within the scene. Honestly, you really could just use standard render if you're going to build this into a comp. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm actually done with my sim for now, so I'm going to undock this sim window and I'm going to close it. And for my sake, I'm going to bring in an Octane live viewer so I can see what I'm doing and you can see what the results are. So I'm going to go to my TurbulenceFD container and I'm going to go to tags and I'm going to put an Octane tag on it. And I'm going to hit render and let's see what we have to start out. Nothing. So let me tell you why. We've got, first of all, I want to put just like a daylight or a sun or something in the scene. And I'm going to go down here to particle rendering, and you'll notice that it is set to density and not temperature. If I change it here to temperature, then we're going to see something. And there we go. There's actually something here already. Now, I don't want to deal with the emission channel right away. So we're going to first bring that down, and then we will add it back in here in a minute. So I'm going to first show you something about voxel size before we jump in, because we're still on this little menu right here. You'll notice that the voxel size is set to 0.1, and that is because the voxel size that we set in the container was 0.1, and it's pulling it from that. So it's kind of important to think about that when you run your sim, because if you run your sim at a high container voxel rate, it's never really going to get smaller than that. When you render it, you could change your voxel size, make it smaller in your render settings here, but it's not going to change the resolution of what you simmed. So keep that in mind when you're doing your sim about what you want the final to look like and maybe how close you're going to be. Your voxel size could be bigger if you were going to be very far away and doing large plumes of smoke. So this 0.1 works really well for what we have here, but if you change it, you'll see what I mean. Go to like a 1 inch voxel size, maybe really get extreme with it, like a 5 inch voxel size or something. You can see that these are just cubes. That's all they are. It's just like pixels on a screen. It's just in 3D. So I'm going to put this back down to 0.1 so we really get that nice resolution here. And now, like I said earlier, let's turn off the emission. I'm inside my volume medium now, and I'm not going to delete the emission. I'm just going to turn the power of it all the way down. So we're not seeing anything but the completely dark smoke right now. There we go. So we've got black smoke. We have no scattering going on. The light is not scattering off it, and nor is it absorbing it. It's just kind of in limbo because we haven't set it up. And I'm going to go back here and show you the absorption and scattering. Now, by default, these are both set with RGB values, and I do not know why, because while it's cool to do colored smoke, most of the time you are not going to want colored smoke. You're going to want either black or white. So what I usually do is I will go into these channels and I will do a basic float texture with a gray value from 0 to 1, and that's going to let us adjust our black and white values in absorption and scattering. I'm just going to copy that value from absorption to scattering, so we just have a 50% gray on this for now. Now the absorption is going to be how much light it absorbs, and the scattering is how much it scatters. If you're working with steam, there's going to be a lot of scattering going on, a lot of light scattering, but you'll see down here at the bottom it still looks kind of gray. It's absorbing too much light. If I bring it up even more, you can see how white that gets. That's how you're going to get that steam look. But we're going for smoke, so we're going to bring this back down. And I'm also going to bring down the scattering. I don't want that much. Now you don't want it too low or it's going to get completely black, but I'm going to bring it down to some darker values in general just so you can see. There we go. It's pretty good, I guess. And now that that's set, let's talk about density a little bit. And it's always been hard for me to wrap my brain around the difference of these, the density and the volume step length. The little steps in between are really what help pull in that super thickness in certain areas. While the density, to me, the way I like to describe it is like kind of like the overall transparency, even though it's not exactly that, but that's how I like to think about it. If I brought this density all the way up, you can see that it's filling up even these little areas over here that have almost completely cooled. And that's why doing the cooling is actually really important, because if you reach the edge of your container, you're going to see that they just kind of flatten out right here, and that's not really good. We don't want that. So I'm going to scale that back, but you can see that it's almost like a full transparency thing. Whereas if I go in and I adjust the volume step length, it's thickening up the thicker areas in between the particles. And I generally keep this actually really low. You've got to be a little bit careful with it. You don't want to crash your system, but I'm going to bring this down to 0.1. So the thick parts are very thick and very dense. And then I'm going to bring up this density to where I like it. And I don't want to bring it up to where I see this flat part that's created by the box. I'm going to bring it to where it's just kind of fading out as it hits the top. And this is a case where if I wanted it thicker, I would have to probably increase the size of my container and resim so that it wasn't hitting the top and just like clipping out completely like this. But you get the idea for now. I'll bring this back down a little bit to see what we're doing. And now we're going to work a little bit on the emission texture portion of this. So I'm going to go down to the emission area down here, and you'll see I have the emission itself and a volume gradient. And I'm going to show you what you can do with the volume gradient to kind of art direct the more fiery explosive parts of this. So let's take our power back up to 1, which is the default, and you'll see it's way too bright. There's way too much flame and fire. So if I go back down to the emission ramp, this is where you can art direct it just a little bit and change your colors. If you wanted to add a little more blue in the flame, if you didn't want it to be that red, you can fix it. And what I like to do is add a third knot here, which is just black, because it lets me control at what point it turns into smoke very easily. So you can see if I set this now, I kind of like that because you only really have the flame happening at the bottom of this. I don't even like that, to tell you the truth. I think that it needs to be black at the top, and it's only fiery down below before it hits the block. But now I'm missing some of my yellow, so I'm going to bring up that yellow until I start to see it here. And I kind of like that. Now we have this max value, and what that's going to do is allow us to adjust this control of the spread a little more. I kind of like that. Really like what that's doing on the bottom. You know, it looks like it's a flame that's like billowing up and engulfing the box on top that we have here as the collider. I really like what that's doing. Super art directy. I kind of feel like the colors are extremely saturated, so I'm just gonna bring them down ever so slightly. It's a bit much. And the flame is also super bright, and so the brightness of it and the light that emits off of it and maybe reflects on other things is going to be controlled by the power of this emitter. So you can see if I bring it up here, now I've got something that looks a little more realistic. It's not completely shining through all of this smoke down here. It actually looks pretty nice and pretty realistic. So I'm going to hit save as fast as I can here. And then another trick I like to do in post is to add a little bit of glow to it. So if you have post inside of your camera and your render engine. If you have post options you want to do in After Effects, that's a good way to do it as well. One of the things I'm noticing here is I feel like that the smoke is still a little bit gray. I feel like maybe it needs to absorb a little bit more. So I'll just bring that down a little bit more. And also there's some stuff you can do using volume gradient with these as well if you want. Sometimes it's really hard to control, but I will tell you that you can. Like if you wanted some of the smoke here at the end to be absorbing less light, you could do that by going to your absorption ramp, going to C4D Octane, or adding a volume gradient in your render engine of choice. Now in this case you have to actually invert this, so I'm gonna switch these colors here so we can see what's happening. But what this is doing now is it's controlling through a ramp what the scatter is. I'm sorry, what the absorption is. And it's absorbing more at the bottom, and then at the top it's going to get lighter and absorb less. And you can kind of do a little thing where, I don't know if you've ever seen smoke where it gets to the end and it kind of gets a little white. That's kind of what this is doing right here. So this is something that's kind of art directable as well. So you've got that absorption that's super dark on the bottom, and then as it goes to the top, it just stops absorbing as much light. And sometimes that looks good. Sometimes that actually helps. Sometimes it doesn't. I kind of like how that looks right now, so I'm actually going to leave it in while we do this. And like I was saying, I'm going to go in and add a little bit of glow to this to give it a little more realistic look. I'm going to take my daylight and I'm going to make it a little bit darker. And then I'm going to go to my camera for this scene, which I actually haven't set up yet. I'm going to do an Octane camera, and it has post controls. If yours doesn't have post controls, you could do this in After Effects or something, but I'm going to enable some bloom, which I'm not a big fan of using bloom unless it's really necessary, but I'm going to add some super bright bloom onto it, but I'm going to cut it off. So I'm going to bring this down just until I see a little bit of bloom coming off of it. And in this case, I really feel like I probably need to go back to my emission and change the emission brightness a little bit. It's too low, and that's really going to show up on that bloom and glow. I'm going to have to bring the bloom and glow actually back down a little bit at this point. But the point is, you want to get that part glowing and the rest of the picture not glowing. So I'm going to go to the bloom power and just bring that down. So now it's kind of glowy. And I'm losing a bit of definition down here, which I really don't like. So there's a couple things I could do. I could make it thicker. I could bring down the intensity of the emission, which I might do just a little bit. But if I bring my density up a little bit, I think it's going to cover some of that. And again, I still think it's just a little too bright. There's just too much getting lost in here. Another thing I could do is go down to that ramp and actually make this yellow a little darker. Because I like having that definition of some of the smoke down in here. And so that's not bad. I think I might go to my absorption and bring it down a little more. And maybe go to my scattering and bring that down a little more as well. Because I still like having those dark blacks in there. And lastly, usually when I add bloom to something, I also have to go in and change the gammas a little bit in my experience. So I'm going to go into the camera and I'm going to turn on my imager so I can adjust some of my camera settings, and I'm going to adjust the gammas just a little bit here too. So now we have the sim going. You can see a little bit of the box at the top, which I don't like. That's going to be under density. So real quick before I render this out, I'm going to go to my volume medium. Let's bring down the density just a little bit. It's not quite as bad there at the top. And I think some of my absorption ramp is part of the problem as well. So I'm going to bring this up. And that's not bad. I have a little bit in here, but I can go fix that later on. I have a little bit of white still showing up in there, but that's pretty good for what I'm showing right now. I might have to go resim, maybe change the cooling a little bit, maybe change my density a little bit, but that's getting close to what I want. And if I scroll through this, we can just take a look at how it looks. But it's very cool. That ramp that I put on the absorption really is helping make it look like it's got a little bit of like extra steam coming off of it. And I like that look. So let's run a quick render on that. Let's see how it looks. Oh, sorry, I was on TikTok while I was waiting for that render. Let's take a look at it and see how it turned out. That's not bad. That's not bad for our first one. I really like what I'm seeing here. I really like what doing the absorption channel ramp thing does with a little bit of the white steam coming off of the smoke. Some of this could probably come down a little bit in saturation. It's just getting a little bit too saturated. You could really go in and fine tune some of those colors on that ramp. There's so much more you could do to this, but I feel like this is a really great start to something that works really well. And honestly, half the time this is going to be part of another scene, or it's going to be comped into something, and in the end there's a lot of extra detail that you could put into this if you wanted to, that you might not actually have to do. So it's up to you how far you want to take this. So now that we've done that, let's take a look at how I use some of these techniques in an actual practical application. So like many animations that I do, I like to experiment with a couple different things, see what I like, see what feels good. So in the end, I found a little break in the smoke that I liked here, and this was perfect, and this is what I locked in. But how did I get here? The first thing that I did was I downloaded this nice looking rocket model off the interwebs, and then I textured it in my render engine of choice. In this case, was Octane. Then I added this proxy rocket here, made kind of a low poly version of this rocket. And the way that I did that is I took the original and I ran it through the poly reduction in Cinema 4D, and I just kind of got a lower poly version of this. I made sure that the proxy version of this was not visible in the editor or in the renderer, and I added a TFD collider to it, and the low poly version is just about all we need for the sim. This is going to allow it to calculate faster than the original high poly model that I have here. This is just about doing just enough to make sure that something's going to look good. Don't get caught up in some of these little details at first that nobody is probably going to notice. It's better to start faster, low poly, easier, faster sims, and then work your way up. If you feel like something doesn't look realistic enough, then you add another level of detail. Your calculation time is going to be lower, and therefore your stress level is going to be a little bit lower too. Wait until something doesn't look right, and then go in and add that detail. You're only hurting yourself if you're concentrating on these things that, let's be honest, most people aren't going to see if they're just watching this 1 or 2 times on Instagram. So the first thing that I did here is I added a floor with a TFD collider, and I did a disk, and that disk has an emitter on it, and I set up the first sim. I'm going to start my interactive sim here so you can see. You can see that this comes out, makes a nice little wave on the floor, and then it slowly rises up, floats back in a timely manner. I've got the buoyancy up a little bit so that it rises up. I've got a lot of pressure, and the flame and the smoke that's coming out of this is going to be super massive because this is a giant rocket, and obviously it's got a lot of power, and there's going to be a lot of good pressure behind this fire and smoke. Once I got that sim done, I decided that I wanted to create a lot more pressure. I needed like way more pressure inside of this rocket engine. So I did this sim here. And what you're going to notice down here under the force is that I upped that pressure to 3000, but I also added a little bit of directional force in the negative Y, so that we're really getting that that blast coming out of it, and that pressure and that very fast smoke. And what you're going to notice here is it's going so fast that you're starting to see these individual particles or individual chunks of particles. And that's actually going to play really well later on, because these little particles are going to end up looking like pieces of like fire or little sparks or things that are kind of coming out at the bottom. And it works perfectly for this type of thing because it looks just right. You can also see that the smoke now, with that extra pressure and stuff going on inside of this box, is really starting to create some interesting looking plumes with more detail and stuff like that going on here. And then in my next version, first of all, you can see this is going real fast because I'm starting to play with some of these settings, and I don't want to wait a long time for an interactive sim. I just want to make sure that this is doing the right thing here. So you can see the plume coming out now. You'll also notice that I added some wind direction and some speed to that wind direction as well. I got my wind direction is going -1, so it's going over here to the left, and it's going about 20 inches a second. In order for it to not go too far, I still want to have it in the frame after it exits the rocket. The buoyancy I brought up a little bit so that it would rise a little bit more, maybe go higher than the rocket itself. This also helps us set up the camera, because now it's going away from the camera as far as wind direction goes, and that'll help us get the shot that we want. And again, you can see that I'm using very low, simple settings, so the sim is pretty much simming very fast here. And what we'll do is we will lock this in, and then we'll up some of those settings. This is just about getting the control and art directing this fire and smoke where we want it to go. After that, I decided to give it a little more detail, and I put some turbulence in here. You can see my turbulence intensity here is 20 inches, and so that's helping create a little bit more character. It is simming a little bit slower because I've got a lot more going on here, but it is behaving. The wind is going the direction that I want it to, and I'm still able to art direct it the way that I want it to look. At this point, I pretty much decided that I liked how the fire and the smoke looked, at least for now. There is one thing that I did, is I just added a cylinder, a basic cylinder, as the proxy for the collider object around this rocket, because it didn't even need the low geometry, low poly version. It just needed a basic collider, just so the smoke isn't going through the vehicle. And also at this point, you can see I started working on my camera. I tend to use a wider angle lens looking up at things if I want to convey a sense that something is really big on a large scale. But the thing is, when you see these rockets on TV, everybody's always very far away from them. So obviously the cameraman has a super telephoto lens. I didn't go in that telephoto, but I did make it telephoto, because that's what people are familiar with seeing when they watch a rocket launch on TV. Now, once I got to this stage, no pun intended, you can see that I've added a lot more here. The first thing that I did was I felt like this needed a tower that it's launching from. I didn't want it to be just a rocket. That would be kind of weird. So I bought a tower. It's probably not historically accurate, and I put it into the scene. Actually, this is like a placeholder that I just kind of put together, but I did buy one eventually and put it in there, and I made the little truss at the top move when the rocket starts to launch. And then I added these little coney bits to the bottom. These serve as the shooting of the volume of fire that's coming out of the rockets. And I didn't want to have to simulate that part of it coming out. This works just fine because it does look like a big, almost like a big piece of geometry that's just super bright. So the way that I went about putting this together was, first I made an emissive texture in Octane, in this case. And I also went into my camera tag itself And I went into post-processing and I added a little bit of bloom on top of it just to really accentuate it with some cutoff. So it's not on top of the rocket or anything else. It's just coming off of those bright parts. Now, these aren't perfectly straight lines of fire in real life. There's like some noise and things in there. So the way that I went about doing that is I just added a simple noise displacement on that emissive texture so that there's some bumpiness of some very, very basic noise going on inside of there. So they're not perfectly flat and perfectly straight. But these things are a little bit noisy and supposed to be constantly changing because it's going so fast and coming out so fast. So here's the trick. I thought about using a vibrate tag for this at first, but when it came down to it, and when it comes down to it, sometimes brute force is best. I decided just to loop a keyframe of these engines going up and down a bunch of times. And then I added an Octane tag to those. And inside of that Octane tag for all of these cones, I went to the motion blur option and I put it on transform vertex. So that way, whenever the motion blur is turned on in my render engine in Octane inside of the camera, that little subtle fast up and down at a high frequency of these cones is actually going to create a blurring effect. So when it starts to take off, you can see them going up and down here over and over. That's going to create a bunch of noisy, motion blurred pillars of fire, and it actually worked really well. It looks like that constant string that's coming out of the bottom there. I also wanted to show some chunks of ice and debris and things falling, because you see that usually when you see a rocket taking off. So here's how I went about doing that. I did a new scene real quick and I added a simple cube, and I'm just going to hit Shift C here and I'm going to type in Voronoi fracture. But all I did was I put the cube inside of a Voronoi fracture, and then under the point generator, I went down to the point amount. I said 50. I wanted 50 random pieces of debris. And once I got them locked in, I pressed C on the keyboard to turn those into geometry. So now you can see that I have random pieces. They're very simple. They don't have to be anything complicated. You're not going to see a lot of detail. These are really small, individual, just random chunks of debris. So once I had all of those cube fragments ready to go, I made sure that all the centers were in the center of all these pieces of debris, and I just copied them over into the project, and I had random chunks. So in order to make it look like that debris was coming off, I just put a pure white texture on it, made sure there was motion blur so you would see them flying past the camera if they were inside of the camera's view. And then I made a cloner object for the debris. Under the cloner object, I just have every single one of these little cube fractures right here. And if you go to the cloner object, you can see that the mode I used was object mode. And all I did was I pointed it to that cylinder that is our proxy or our collider object for the smoke. And I actually didn't use any physics. You would think, oh, okay, now he's going to run physics and let them fall. I didn't even do that. I just took the cloner object and I added a random effector to it. And under random effector, under parameters, I just keyframed the rotation. So they're moving ever so slightly as they're falling or rotating, some of them faster than others. And I also made them move slowly. And all I did on that was I took the cylinder that they're all attached to and I made it slowly move down, but very slow, because this is a huge rocket and they're falling at a fast rate. But since it's so huge, it's so tall, it doesn't look like it's going fast, especially when you've got all this other stuff going on and you got a telephoto lens and everything. So this effect actually worked really well. And then on the camera here, so all I did here is keyframe the focal length of the camera. I just went to the focal length, keyframed it here so that there's a nice little almost snap zoom that goes into the engines, and also added a little bit of focus play, so it kind of looks natural, like someone was trying to focus in at the same time they were zooming. And then I added a vibrate tag to the camera itself to make it move ever so slightly, but then when it zooms in, because a camera with a telephoto lens this long, any little thing, the wind, somebody sneezes next to it, you're going to see very big vibrations. So I made the vibrations and the vibration tag increase the further zoomed in it was, and it created a very realistic effect of what you would see if somebody had a very expensive super zoom lens there at the launch pad to get that shot. Also, originally I was planning on putting this emitter on every single engine and having the smoke come out of every single engine, but honestly, again, overkill. It turned out to be overkill because it's not something you're even going to notice. That would have increased my sim time probably by 5. So I decided to leave it as is, just with one emitter. And then finally, I decided to add a little bit of fog displacement. Now, not every render engine can do this. A lot of them can though. And I was using Octane, so I used fog displacement. If I go to my tag for rendering my volumes here, and I go to my particle rendering, you can see that there is not just scattering, absorption, emission, there's also this displacement. And I use the default OSL displacement that they have in here, and I just messed with the parameters a little bit. Now, the reason that you would use this displacement on fog is maybe to add a little bit of character to it. You can add a little more detail. You can also maybe cover up some things that are going on. You can cover up something if it's like low, or if it's really big voxels and you're noticing some voxels a little bit. This really helps kind of just glue all of this stuff together. The only thing is you have to be very careful with how you use it, and you have to be very subtle, and I'm going to show you why. This is best in moderation. You've got these parameters here, down here for it, that control things like the amount of displacement, the frequency of the displacement, the animation, like the waves of the displacement that are going through it. And it's really best to hit the extremes on some of these settings sometimes. See what it does, then dial it back down once you really know what you're controlling, because it can get confusing sometimes. Now, I added some of these wispy displacement things in here to add a little bit more detail, to maybe cover up a few things on here and cheat it a little bit, make it go faster. And this stuff looks really good as a still, but something that you have to keep in mind is adding this displacement to something that's animated. You have to be a little bit more subtle. You have to be very careful with how you set it up, or it will look kind of odd. Like, this is one of my first renders here, and you can see it's too wispy and has these weird swirl things going through it, and it wasn't really doing what I thought it would do. It's not adding that detail, it's just making it look weird or even a little bit fake. And the next version that I did was a little bit better. I really liked at the beginning. You can see there's some startup time here. This was my pre-sim portion right here that I didn't use, just to get the smoke going, and I started it later on once it started to look good right here. But quickly, as I'm changing some of the settings and keyframing some of these settings inside of Cinema 4D on this displacement, it goes up a little too high. And right here, the frequency and the small little wisps and things are getting too small, and they're looking a little more steamy, and they're too wispy. So I have a technique that I use when I come across something like this, and I use it in everything that I do, which is keyframing certain parts that I like and then filling in the gaps. When you're animating these wisps and displacements inside of fog volumes, what I have found is if you even bring it up slightly just to get a little bit of that detail in there, if the frequency and the movement is not animated, you're going to get the smoke moving, but then the little wisps and displacement kind of lock into place and don't move. And that's why they look great in a still, but they don't look good in an animation. That's why you have to, A, make it subtle, and B, animate it. But you also don't want to animate it too much. You want to just tick it up a little bit so there's some slight subtle movement inside of the frequency. The amount of the displacement isn't too much, and you really got to work to find that sweet spot and make it do what you want it to do. So in my second or third render or whatever it was, where I really liked what I had right here, it only started to fall apart maybe about right here. And you can tell that that keyframing is changing. But I also like what it looks like once it zooms in. I think it looks fine there. You don't notice any of that. So what I did for this is I use a technique that I use a lot when, not just for smoke or fire, but for anything in Cinema 4D that's keyframed where I like something but I don't like another thing. And so all I did was I took these keyframes right here, and in my dope sheet, originally, I had the settings starting here at the beginning of the animation, and then at the end of the animation, they were up to higher values. And since I liked the beginning and I liked the end, what I did was I went to the beginning here to around the part where it started to fall apart. And I went to these parameters, all 4 of them, and I keyframed them. Then I went to the end of the animation after it zooms in, where I like how it looks, and I did the same thing. So now we know that this front half right here and the back half right here are going to look how we want them to look. The part that's too wispy is all the part in the middle right here. So all I did was select those keyframes, and I control dragged all the way out and put it about 3 or 4 keyframes away from the ending that I like. So what that's doing here is it's keeping those values of this keyframe in the middle right where I liked them here on frame 27. And it keeps those values so that it doesn't fall apart until we get to frame 104, and then it quickly changes during this zoom here back to the part at the end that I liked. And I use that for a lot of things. I will keyframe something I like and I'll work backwards. And you can kind of see what my wireframe here looked like of this scene. Then I ran my final detailed sim. I brought some of the particle sizes down, some of the voxel sizes down, so it was a little more detailed. I ran the sim and then I rendered it. And on 63090s, it was 15 seconds a frame, which isn't bad at all. And I know some of you are going to say 63090s. Well, I don't have 63090s. Well, even if you have 13090, you're going to get under 2 minutes a frame for this, which in my opinion, 1 or 2 minutes a frame is a good place to be at on any render. And once all of that was good to go, it was time to go into After Effects for the post-processing. So this is where I added a little bit of Red Giant and some other plugins. So I'm going to break that down a little bit. First of all, on my render itself, if I just solo it here, and we only look at the effects that are on this layer, you'll notice that I've got some RSMB Pro in here. Now, I'm not usually a pusher of RSMB unless you're doing it the right way. I like real motion blur. However, this is a great technique to kind of blur some of that smoke, because the smoke is moving very fast, but because of the nature of my particular render engine, I don't get the motion blur that I would like inside of Octane and inside of smoke in particular. So adding a little bit of this RSMB as a small amount really did the trick for this. If I zoom in here, you can see the smoke here. If I turn off RSMB, you can see that it's really, really helping these individual frames to look like they have a lot more fast motion going on. This is a really great quick fix for this. And you can see when it plays back how you get that blur on all of that smoke, and it looks great. The other thing cool that it does is down here on the engines, because RSMB is almost like malfunctioning in this case, it actually works to my advantage, because you've got those particles that were going so fast that they ended up kind of looking more like bits of fire and bits of spark. And RSMB really doesn't know what to do with that, but it in turn made it kind of streaky, and that actually ended up working to my advantage. I also went in and added a bit of my favorite filter in Red Giant Universe, which is the VHS filter. I always kind of joke every year that I got to renew my VHS filter because I really like it. And I didn't really overdo it. I didn't make it look super VHS-y or anything, but what I did like about it is that I could mess with the noise and some of the color offsets and things. It was desaturating way too much, so I pulled it back a bit. Still was a little desaturated though, so I added the levels on top of that just to really make it look a little more vibrant when it was online on Instagram and things. And I think I also crushed the blacks a little bit too here. You can see the difference. It's subtle, but it helps. And then a great plugin for this is Red Giant Universe's Heatwave plugin. It's perfect. There are a number of different settings. I had the heat intensity and some of the motion animated, of course. But when the camera is zoomed out, I made sure that the heat size was lower. It was set to 100 here. So you don't see that much of it, but when the camera zooms in, you can see that I've keyframed that size, so you get these bigger waves. And if I move down here, what you'll see is on the edge of these engines and all these pieces, you get these waves. It's evolving waves that are going on, and it looks like heat waves. And if I turn it off, you can see this straight part of the engine and part of a wing or something here. When I turn it on, you can see what it's doing with those little waves. Just little things that add to the realism. And they also cover up some of the fact that I only made this in 6 hours. So it's not bad. And so you can see it turned out pretty good. There's still a few things when it comes to the wisps that I'm not 100% happy with, but I feel like it did the trick and it worked really well for a very, very fast turnaround. And the fact that it's just for fun. It makes for a really good daily just learning how to do something. Hopefully that gave you a great overview of some of the basics in TFD, how to initially jump in there and start using it. I'm sure many of you will take this to the next level, and I really hope that you do. And please, if you do, tag us in your posts. In order to do that, please follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all the things, and tag us when you've made a render. We'd love to see what you did. So until next time, I'm Dave Koss. Have a good one. Mograph.com, an online resource for motion graphic artists. Start your week with the Mograph podcast. Industry news, interviews with your favorite artists, and terrible humor. Watch live shows and interviews from Mograph events like NAB, SIGGRAPH, Half-Res, and local meetups.
This is exactly what I should be doing.
Our Mograph Talks feature live demos and motivation from artists all around the world.
Sometimes you gotta make stuff that you're not gonna put on your reel, and I'm not here to judge.
What if Rick and Morty show up for the countdown at midnight? That's where I peaked in life, in my career.
We gotta stop this thing, Rick! It's gonna kill us all!
Hear from the people that create your software, design your render engines, and artists that are changing the face of modern motion graphics.
You get that render done. Yeah, you better frame what?
Mograph tutorials and online classes will teach you about Cinema 4D, After Effects, as well as other popular software and render engines.
Throw in the HDR Studio, take the render settings, pick the HDR, put a reflection, and gorgeous.
Join the conversation in our live sessions.
Ah, that's so funny. All right. I'm gonna live forever.
Subscribe today and get the latest updates on our YouTube and other social media channels.
Take all your dreams and just do it!
Subscribe to Mograph.com.